Hello, everyone, and welcome to this seminar on open science. I'm Cristina Zockmeister from the steering committee of the Italian Reproducibility Network. And this is the second of this year's seminar on open science organized by the Italian Reproducibility Network with the support of the IAP, the Italian Psychological Association. In our first seminar, Valentina Pasquale gave a very interesting introduction on open science and its transformative potential. This is available on YouTube for those of you who could not see it online. You find the link to it on our site, ITRN.org. In case you are new viewers for our seminars, in case there are new people in the audience, I'll give just a little bit of organizational information. The presentation, as usual, will take approximately 45 minutes, followed by time for question. If you want to ask a question, please indicate it in the chat. You can either write the question in the chat or you can just write the word question. If you do write the question, we will read it loud for you to our speaker. Otherwise, we will give you the floor and you can ask it yourself. Please note that this meeting will be recorded and then will be posted on YouTube. And so if you do want to ask a question, but do not want to be that your face is recorded, just leave your camera off. If you are a student, please write in the chat near to the word question also that you are a student. So we will give you the floor before the other people that are not students, because students have can ask their questions first. We prefer to give our time to the students. And I think that these are the general information for this meeting. Now I'm very, very happy to introduce today's speaker, Nicholas Coles. Just a few words. I do not want to spend too much time on it, but Nicholas does research, is a research scientist at Stanford University, with a PhD in social psychology. And he has various research interests, mainly, if I'm correct, on emotions, and in particular, the social, cognitive, physiological processes that underlie emotions, and which is interesting, the way in which facial expressions affect our emotions. And this is also interesting because I mentioned it is interesting because it is a theme that has attracted a lot of attention as regards the reproducibility of research. And he's also interested in cross-cultural research and has published really a lot of manuscripts about these topics and received also prestigious grants and awards. As many of you maybe already know, the Einstein Foundation Early Career Award. So congratulations, this is really a great achievement. All of these are really great achievements. He's interested in meta science, and regarding to this, he is the director of the Psychological Science Accelerator. I'm pretty sure that some of you know what the Psychological Science Accelerator is, others do not, but Nicholas will tell us a lot about this, so I don't go into details about this. So again, welcome, Nicholas. Thank you a lot for having accepted our invitation, and now the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, let me get the screen sharing. Okay, so you should see the slides. Now I see my notes. Perfect. Thank you so much for having me. It's so wonderful that we live in sort of a technologically integrated world so that I can do this quite easily, although I would have also loved to do this in person. So that's always something we could consider in the future. But let me get started for now. So I'm really interested in this fictional play called Constellations. It's really shaped my thinking in a way that I never anticipated. But in this fictional play, the audience watches as an unlikely romance evolves between a cosmologist named Marianne and a beekeeper named Roland. And throughout the play, the cosmologist Marianne talks passionately about things like quantum mechanics and string theory, and most important for my talk today, multiverse theory. And eventually the young beekeeper Roland has a revelation, and he states that in the quantum multiverse, every choice and decision you've ever made exists in an unimaginably vast ensemble of parallel universes. Now, this play is, of course, fictional, and this quote is maybe a little hyperbolic, but today I'm going to argue that this idea about the multiverse may not be fictional, and that this multiverse may not only characterize the reality that we exist in, but also the tool that we try to use to understand that reality, which is science. So I'm going to argue that just like our cosmologist Marianne in this story, we too make many choices in our scientific endeavors. And I'm going to argue that those choices have important consequences for the scientific inferences that we make. And most importantly, I'm going to make the case that one of our best bets for addressing this so-called multiverse problem is big team science. So first, I'm going to provide an example of what I mean when I say the word or phrase science multiverse. And I'm going to note that I'm calling this the science multiverse because other people have described it that way. But I also want to point out that this has long been discussed in other literatures as a random effects problem or a generalizability problem or generalizability crisis. So it's an issue with many names. But to orient ourselves to the issue, I would like to invite you all to imagine a typical study in psychology, keeping in mind that not all studies will look like this, but that we can use it as an example. So if the scientist in our story, Marianne, is interested in testing some sort of psychology theory, she would probably start by deriving some sort of hypothesis about how the world works. To test that hypothesis, she would then design a study. She would then run the study, and once the study is done, she would process and analyze her data, and then form some sort of conclusion. This is pretty standard in psychology, and if we did this, we would probably then go on to write a paper about our findings, assuming, of course, that we've discovered something reliable and psychologically interesting about the world. But if you remember the previous story, we might wonder about the notion of a science multiverse. And once we start wondering about that, we realize that there are many predictions that we could have derived to test that theory. And for each one of those predictions, there's many studies we could have designed as tests. And for each one of those studies, there's many different ways we could have executed the study. And for each one of those study executions, there's many different ways we could have modeled and analyzed the data. And if you want to quantify things, in this very simplistic example, the size of the multiverse is the number of reasonable predictions that could have been derived, multiplied by the number of reasonable ways the study could have been designed, multiplied by the number of reasonable ways the study could have been executed, multiplied by the number of reasonable ways that the data could have been processed and analyzed. And if there were only 5 reasonable ways to do those things, just as an example, 5 reasonable ways each one of those things could have been done, the size of the multiverse would be 625. Yet, when we do our research, we typically only get to occupy one of those realities. And it raises an important epistemological question. Given the sheer size of this theorized multiverse, to what extent should we believe that the conclusion from a single study is actually a reliable piece of evidence? And I think this depends on how consequential those decisions actually are. If those decisions don't matter, then it's okay. But we have some evidence that they at least sometimes do matter. And for the sake of time, I'm going to focus today on the design of studies, the execution of studies, and the way that we analyze our data, starting with study design. So in 2020, Laney and colleagues published a mass collaboration paper where 15 research groups were each asked to design a study to test the same exact research question. One of those research questions was whether people explicitly self-report that they possess negative automatic associations with negatively stereotyped social groups. So of course, there's many reasonable ways that one could go about examining this important research question. And what they found is that the research groups all took slightly different approaches. So one team showed images of a negatively stereotyped social group in the US, and then asked participants if they're personally aware of any immediate gut level reaction using a Likert type scale. Another team asked a dichotomous question about whether participants were aware of any personal automatic negative associations with ethnic minorities, broadly defined. And another team asked a Likert scale question about whether participants believe that people in general can have an unconscious negative automatic association. They then randomly assigned participants to complete one version of the study. And this is what they found. To orient you to the graph, x-axis here is Cohen's d, which in this case, the 0 is roughly equivalent to saying that participants neither agreed nor disagreed that they possess negative automatic associations. And some of the methods that researchers developed indicated that participants were quite aware of these negative automatic associations. But other methods indicated that participants were quite unaware of these negative automatic associations. And when you look at all of the studies that were designed, what you see is just a lot of variability. And this variability doesn't seem to be driven solely by sampling error. So although it's imperfect, the I-squared statistic is one way that we can quantify the amount of variability driven by something other than sampling error. And in this instance here, the I-squared statistic is suggesting that almost all of this observed variability is driven by something other than sampling error, which is suggesting that these differences in how the researchers design their study is producing all of this variability in the observed pattern of results. So it seems that the way that we design our studies matters. What about the way that we execute our studies? Well, many of you are probably pretty familiar with this kind of work. There are many examples of it, but one that I'll discuss today is the 2018 paper by Rick Klein and colleagues. Now in this paper, they took 28 research studies and had 62 research teams run close direct replications of that original study. In the visualization of the results, the original study effect size is denoted with a triangle, and then the replication effect sizes are denoted with tick marks. So in this discussed sensitivity study, the original study yielded a pretty large effect, and the 62 replications yielded a distribution of effects that were roughly centered around 0. And there's quite a bit of variability in the effects that they observed, but in this scenario, it actually does appear to be largely driven by sampling error. If you look at the I-squared statistic, it's pretty close to 0. But when you look at all of the studies that they had replicated, in 40% of the scenarios, the observed variability exceeded what they would expect from sampling error alone. And this is pretty common in these many lab studies. We observe some sort of between lab variability in the effect that we're trying to estimate. And what this is suggesting is if we're running the same exact study and we're just running it in different locations, there must be something about the people that we're studying or the way that we're actually executing the study that is introducing some differences that's changing the pattern of results in a, perhaps in a slight manner, but also perhaps in a pretty extreme manner. So the way that we design our studies matter, and the way that we run and execute the studies matter. But I'll also briefly talk about data analysis. So statisticians have long discussed this issue of robustness analyses and sensitivity analyses, but I think it's something that social scientists are now really starting to take seriously. And one study that's highlighted this issue very well is one that Silverzahn and colleagues published in 2018, originally in Nature, and they've done some follow-up extensions since then. And in one of the studies, they asked 29 research teams to evaluate whether dark-skinned soccer players are more likely than light-skinned players to receive a red card. And so the 29 research teams were each given the same exact database without any specific instructions regarding how to analyze the data, just the research question that they need to look at instead. And so this is the graph that they have. Basically on the y-axis, we have an odds ratio. Over here, it's suggesting that dark and light skinned players were equally likely to receive a red card. As we move up the y-axis, dark skinned players are more likely to receive the red card. And as we move down, the dark skinned players are less likely to receive the red card. And the results are also color-coded based on whether the estimated relationship was statistically significant. So you can see here that these two research teams both estimated that dark-skinned players were approximately 3 times more likely than their light-skinned counterparts to receive a red card. But only one of their estimates was statistically significant. I'm not sure why there's the discrepancy. I imagine maybe they used like a mixed effects model and introduced more randomness into this model. But regardless, the estimate is similar, but the significance of it is different. When you look at all of the teams, what you see is that their results range from estimating that dark-skinned players were 11% less likely to receive a red card, up to them being 300% more likely to receive a red card. And in 70% of these cases, the estimates were statistically significant. Now, I want to note that this isn't just particularly based on like a difficult data set. This has been observed many, many times in the health sciences, which has forced them to really grapple with questions around causality and the appropriate way to model their data. But this is happening increasingly frequently in psychology. And another example of this is a recent paper by Botvinnik, Netzer, and colleagues, where they had 70 teams analyze the same data set and test the same hypothesis regarding neural activity during decision-making under risk. And one of their most remarkable findings is that no two teams in general chose the exact same data analysis workflow. And for simplicity, they categorize the data analysis approaches based on the probability of yielding a hypothesis-consistent effect. And we don't need to get into the details of their methods because you can just look at the clusters that they provide here. And what this is essentially suggesting is that the hypothesized or estimated patterns of neural activation looked quite different across teams. And the probability of yielding a hypothesis-consistent effect varied by nearly 25%, depending on the data analysis strategy chosen by the researchers. Now, the most remarkable finding from this study, in my opinion, is that teams reported high confidence in their own results, high confidence in the idea that the other teams would find similar results. And what this is suggesting is that we exist in a science multiverse, but we're often unaware of it. We think that other people could use a different design or analyze their data in a different way or run the study in a different way and get similar results. But the meta-scientific work that we've conducted on this topic so far suggests that that's an erroneous assumption. So then the next question is, how could we attempt to explore some of this complexity? It's suggesting that the traditional way that we've done research is severely limited in its ability to produce generalizable claims. So what should we do next? Well, one thing that I've really advocated for is that we should work on building up big team science and that we should strive to work together. And of course, the area that I've done most of this work in is with a group called the Psychological Science Accelerator. And for those who are not familiar with the Accelerator, we are a globally distributed network of labs that pool our intellectual and material resources in hopes of accelerating the accumulation of reliable and generalizable knowledge in psychology. And this map is actually quite out of date. We actually now have nearly 2,500 researchers from around the world, which shows just how quickly the network has been expanding over the past couple of years. And what we're trying to do with this group is combine our resources and our expertise to run studies that can examine the complex nature of humans and the complex nature of the thing that we're trying to study. And we've only been doing this for 5 years. So what I'll be showing you today is almost a proof of concept, a pilot of what it is that we might be able to achieve if we try to do science with large teams, science that extends beyond our institutions and beyond our country borders. And so when you're looking at these studies that I'm presenting today, I hope that you'll sort of view them as not just interesting, but also indicative of the mere beginning of what big team science might bring to our field. So I'll start with the first ever study that we ran with this group. In social psychology, it's pretty widely accepted that people will quickly and involuntarily form impressions of other people based off of facial appearances alone. And so the moment that you joined this Zoom call, you saw my face and you made a snap judgment about who I am as a person, what sort of traits I have. And the question that we asked for this first study is, how is it that people do that? According to a popular theoretical model, people make these judgments based on evaluations of trustworthiness and evaluations of dominance. More specifically, what this is arguing is that all of the traits that you may have ascribed to me when you first saw my face, such as the extent to which I'm humorous, the extent to which I'm good at managing my calendar, the extent to which I'm on top of time zone differences, they argued that all those judgments are mere combinations of more fundamental evaluations of trustworthiness and dominance. That's a pretty interesting claim. It really sort of simplifies our world or our understanding of how we make these social judgments around the world. But like a lot of psychology theories, it was developed and validated using data from mostly Western participant samples. So to examine the cross-cultural generalizability of this model, we performed a global replication. In this instance, we started with the same exact theory-derived prediction, which is that there's going to be 2 factors that explain all of this variation in trait ratings. We then used the same exact design as the original studies. And in this context, that meant that people viewed a variety of faces and then rated those faces on traits like attractiveness, aggressiveness, and intelligence. And what we want to see is whether there's 2 factors that underlie all those judgments. We then ran the study on approximately 12,000 participants from 41 countries, which for today, I'll just collapse into 11 different world regions. And then we used 2 major data analysis strategies, both of which informed our overall conclusion. So we started by using the same principal component analysis strategy used in the original research. And when we did that, we found that the theoretical model actually generalized pretty well across the 11 world regions. It wasn't perfect in Eastern Europe, of course, but overall, if you looked at this pattern of results, you would declare or be likely to declare that this was a pretty successful replication of the theoretical predictions. We then used an alternative data analysis strategy that many of us and many of our reviewers felt improved upon the limitations of that original analysis strategy. We used exploratory factor analysis, which has some different assumptions built into the procedure. And when we chose that analysis strategy and implemented it, we actually found that the model didn't replicate very well across world regions. And if we trust the results from this model, we would conclude that the way that people make social judgments based on facial expressions, or facial appearances rather, actually varies quite extensively across world regions, which might suggest that the way that we learn to make judgments about our social worlds is highly dependent upon our cultures and might be partly based on learning. So that's a pretty opposite conclusion than the one that we would have reached if we would have only focused on the principal components analysis. And of course, this has implications for the way that we understand social judgments across cultures. But for today's talk, I want to emphasize that this study is highlighting that issues with generalizability are multiplicative. Because if we limit ourselves to just one data analysis strategy, we do see that things are generalizing quite well across world regions. But when we turn our attention to an alternative data analysis strategy, we see something that looks a lot different. And I want to emphasize that I believe that this applies to any branch of the research pipeline and can be multiplicative across multiple branches. So as an example, you can imagine that there are certain study designs that are highly replicable across world regions, but other study designs that are not. You can imagine that there are some psychological processes that we study that will be relatively stable across contexts and cultures, whereas others may not. And I think this is the reason why psychology seems to move so slow, because these things are multiplicative and we end up spending decades debating why we're seeing discrepant results. And the idea of big team science is that we try to accelerate those debates by, first of all, collaborating with each other to design better studies, but then designing and implementing those studies in a way that allows us to assess the potentially multiplicative constraints on the generalizability of our conclusions. So the next project I'm going to discuss is the Many Smiles collaboration. This is not an official PSA study because I had to run it as my dissertation and couldn't navigate some of the formal policies that we've created in the PSA. But I want to discuss it because I know that some of my collaborators are actually in the meeting today. So I wanted to celebrate some of the work that we've done together. So the Many Smiles collaboration is a global adversarial team of researchers who came together to conduct foundational tests of facial feedback theory. And if you're not aware of that idea, the facial feedback hypothesis refers to the simple idea that sensory motor feedback from our facial expressions can subsequently impact our conscious experience of emotion. In other words, smiling can make us feel happy and posing frowns can make us feel sad. But as many of you know, when we started this project, researchers were pretty fiercely debating whether these effects are valid in the first place. So to move that conversation forward, we formed the Many Smiles collaboration. We brought together a large team of facial feedback proponents, skeptics, and agnostics with three goals. First, we wanted to specify our theoretical perspective regarding when facial feedback effects, if real, should most reliably emerge. Two, we wanted to develop an experiment that would test these perspectives and resolve any outstanding disagreements. And then three, we wanted to execute this experiment globally. And I'll note once again, science moves quickly. It says that the paper is accepted at Nature Human Behavior. I'm proud to say that it's actually now published in Nature Human Behavior. So the collaboration began with a pretty simple question. Does posing happy expressions cause people to feel happier? And one of our first notable findings is that if you ask a seemingly simple question to a large adversarial team of researchers, you are not going to get a very simple answer. And in general, we found that we disagreed about three main things. We first disagreed about whether the facial pose has to resemble a natural expression of happiness. We disagreed about whether facial poses could initiate feelings of happiness in otherwise neutral contexts, or merely amplify ongoing feelings of happiness. And I'll tell you a little bit about how that's operationalized in a couple of slides. And then last, we disagreed about whether the effects would be driven by things like placebo effects or demand characteristics. So to test whether posing happy expressions cause people to feel happier, we had participants pose both happy and neutral facial expressions in random order. to see whether those expressions could initiate versus merely amplify ongoing feelings of happiness, we manipulated whether participants viewed happy photos while they were completing those facial poses. So if facial feedback can only amplify ongoing feelings of happiness, we should only expect to see an effect when those positive images are shown, not when participants are just staring at a blank, non-emotional screen. To create more natural expressions of happiness, some participants mimicked photos of actors who were displaying highly realistic expressions of happiness. So there was not only activation around the mouth, but also around the eyes, which many people argue is associated with a genuine expression of happiness. For a less natural expression of happiness, other participants were simply asked to move their lips towards their ears. And this creates sort of a partial smile that in many cultures might be interpreted perhaps as a polite, non-authentic smile. And then last, to be able to compare our results to the recent failures to replicate, we had some participants complete that controversial pen and mouth facial feedback task that started these debates about the replicability of the ideas. So all the collaborators agreed that these sets of conditions would provide foundational tests of the facial feedback hypothesis. So we then had 26 collaborating labs collect data from about 3,900 participants in 19 countries. And as Marco Tullio, who's here today, can attest, we did not find much between country variability, and it actually ended up being quite a pain to try to model between country variability when there in fact was so little of that variability. So today I'm actually just going to focus on describing the simple fixed effects, but know if you try to introduce a random effect based on country, that you will get very similar results, which is probably suggesting or might be indicative of the cross-cultural reliability of the effects that we studied. So the results here are graphed in a way that roughly mimics the experiment design matrix. So we have self-reported happiness on the y-axis and facial expression pose on the x-axis. We have separate columns for each of the facial feedback tasks, and then separate rows for whether positive stimuli were present. So I'll first focus on the effects of smiling in the facial mimicry task in the presence of positive stimuli. And this is telling us whether or not a high quality happiness pose can amplify ongoing feelings of happiness. And we found that it could. Participants reported significantly higher levels of happiness after posing happy versus neutral facial expressions. We next looked at whether this task could initiate feelings of happiness in otherwise non-emotional contexts. And we found that it could. We actually thought that the effect would be bigger here than here, and it actually was approximately similar in size. We found the same pattern of results in the task where we had participants pose relatively low quality expressions of happiness. And so this is suggesting that high quality, authentic facial expressions are not strictly necessary for this effect to emerge, that even subtle shifts in the configuration of our facial expressions causally shapes our emotional experience. And last, there was the replication of the controversial pen and mouth task. And contrary to many of the collaborators' expectations, we did not find much evidence of facial feedback effects in this condition. Now, I will say that it does ultimately depend on how you handle inclusion criteria and how you model the data. So some analyses with loosened inclusion criteria did yield pretty robust evidence of a pen and mouth effect here. But in general, the pre-registered analyses provided evidence that was quite consistent with the idea that there is not an effect in this condition. So this one is particularly challenging to interpret, but these other two, or rather other four conditions provided extremely robust evidence of facial feedback effects. And I'll note that these analyses were run with participants who were judged by two coders to be completely unaware of the true purpose of the study. There was a complex cover story that I haven't described today. And so we have some confidence that these effects weren't merely driven by things like placebo effects and demand characteristics. That being said, I do have some follow-up work on demand characteristics and placebo effects that I could discuss later if people are interested. But what I want to highlight for today's presentation is not the findings necessarily, but the collaboration structure. Because we had several predictions, which led to several different study designs run across multiple study sites with many different data analysis procedures and an extremely nuanced conclusion. And I don't know how everyone in the collaboration felt about what we found and how, the paper that we ended up getting. But in my experience, the collaborators who I've spoken to have remarked that it feels like we made a decade of progress in just a few years. And it felt like we were able to accelerate progress on this issue by combining our intellectual and material resources and engaging in big team science. So I have about 5 minutes left before I want to transition to questions. So I'm going to go through these next slides relatively quickly and not tell you much about the actual thing that we were studying, but the Psychological Science Accelerator ran 3 global studies on COVID-19 where we really embraced this idea of a multiverse problem. And this paper is now published in Affective Science for those who want to see it. But essentially what I really want to emphasize is that the way that we're trying to tackle this is by designing studies where we're testing multiple predictions, designing multiple paradigms to test those predictions, running them in many sites across the world, and analyzing the data in many justifiable ways. And what we found in one of the studies that we recently published is essentially that a very popular, I know I'm cutting through these slides, so don't worry about it. Essentially what we found across all these slides is extremely robust evidence that a popular communication nudge increases anxiety, made people feel anxious, and didn't have any actual positive benefits for the thing that it was designed to improve, which is getting people to engage in protective behaviors, getting them to support policies that were designed to curb the spread of COVID-19, and they get them to seek more information about the pandemic. And we were able to have extremely robust conclusions about that only because we analyzed the data in so many different ways, studied the question in so many different world regions, and tackled it with so many different designs. And that paper is published in Affective Science for those who are interested in seeing a bit more about how we try to tackle the generalizability crisis or the multiverse problem through that work. And that's indicative of the kind of work that I think the Psychological Science Accelerator will be focusing on in the future. So it's been 5 years, and we probably have a little over 12 studies in our portfolio at this point. And all of these studies are designed to in some way help us address the science multiverse problem. So these 3 studies give you a flavor of what we've done in the early days, but I wanted to sort of briefly talk about not just what we want to do in the future, but what I think all researchers can do in the future. And the simplest thing that I think we can do as a discipline is acknowledge this problem, both as producers and consumers of science. And I think that this means that we need to start considering whether heterogeneity is the rule or the exception. And it seems to me that psychologists have historically assumed that it's the exception, but I would like to argue that it should be the rule. If we consider it the rule, that means that in our papers, we would more carefully consider and discuss how differences in the design, execution, and analysis strategy might have impacted our inferences. And it means that in our papers and in our dealings with the press and various science stakeholders, that we would communicate our uncertainty and communicate the limitations of work that only explores single designs and single contexts and single analysis strategies. Now, of course, you could form or join ongoing big team science work that's designed to tackle these problems. So I'll note that any researcher in any discipline and in any career stage can join the Psychological Science Accelerator. And there's a lot of different things that people can do within this group. You could contribute to something like data collection, which is what most members do, but you can also help us with data analysis and community organization and project management and the development of other pieces of infrastructure. So there's a lot that you can do if you want to get involved in the Psychological Science Accelerator, but I'll also note that I spend a lot of time supporting other big team science collaborations in other disciplines. And so if your interests don't perfectly align with what we do in the Psychological Science Accelerator, I hope you'll still consider me a resource as you join other collaborations or build up your own collaboration. Now I can talk about all of that more as we move into the Q&A, but I promise I'd try to keep this to 45 minutes, so I'll wrap things up here. By being in this virtual meeting today, you fundamentally changed the reality that you occupy. Because you could imagine some parallel universe where you skipped this talk and instead went to go grab a coffee or work on a paper or watch some TV. But you didn't do that. You came to today's talk. And so the universe that you occupy is now different than the one that you would have occupied if you would have chosen not to come to this talk. And I think that's pretty cool. And moving forward, we're all going to continue to make a dizzying amount of decisions that, when combined, are going to drastically change the scientific inferences that we make and the lives that we live and the impact that we get to have on the world. And so as you navigate those decisions, I hope that you'll keep this multiverse problem in mind. I hope that you'll be humble in your scientific pursuits and your scientific conclusions. And I hope that you'll consider working with other people and working together in our joint quest towards knowledge. Thanks, everyone. And I think now we're going to move to questions.
Thank you a lot, Nicholas. It has really been very inspiring, I must say. I don't know if there are already questions, but in the meanwhile, I may ask you one thing. I think it's really useful what you have done with this psychological science accelerator. I wonder whether whether in other sciences they are, for instance, did people from other sciences contact you to do this kind of studies? Because I think it would be really great to have a science accelerator that could be, this could be the pilot for a bigger science accelerator. I don't know.
Yeah, so what I'm seeing so far is that there is a lot of cross-disciplinary interest in this kind of work, and it's also been happening quite robustly in other disciplines. So of course, everyone's familiar with the physics CERN and the Large Hadron Colliders. People are familiar with the Human Genome Project. They're familiar with some of the large-scale collaborations happening in astronomy, for instance. And so what I think we're seeing is that some of the physical sciences have and genetics in particular have already done quite a bit of work in this area. Cancer biology is another area where they've done a lot of these collaborations. But what we've been witnessing over the past 5 years is a proliferation of this model of science. And it used to only be something that someone could do with $1 billion of investment in creating these research centers, these international research centers. But I think what we're seeing today is that these can hypothetically be run on relatively small budgets in a relatively grassroots manner and in a way that's extremely inclusive, so that anyone in the world could join, as opposed to just the people who wrote the original grant. And so I spend quite a bit of time consulting groups that are working on this, and working with those groups, including the Many Babies Consortium, which has a very similar model to the Psychological Science Accelerator, but applies it to infant development research. There's the Mini Primates Consortium, which focuses on doing this kind of work on primate cognition. And then I'm also working in a variety of other areas, but one that is a little bit less focused on psychology is a group that's creating essentially an accelerator for virtual reality research, where they've noticed that much of the research on the metaverse and virtual reality suffers from the same problems that psychology research suffers from. And so they're beginning to build infrastructure and collaborations that can try to accelerate the pace of that research, which is particularly important given that many of the tech industries are heavily investing in creating a virtual reality metaverse, despite the fact that the science is sort of lagging behind when it comes to understanding how people will navigate that and how it will work. So in short, yes, I think there's a lot of interest within sub-disciplines in psychology and in disciplines outside of psychology. And I do collaborate with some of those people, and I'm very open to collaborating with other people on that as well.
Thank you a lot. And are there any questions from our audience today? Please let us know.
There is one in the chat.
I don't see it. Okay, but maybe they asked it directly to you.
Let's see. So I can read it out and then answer. So,
there's Marco that raised his hands. So Marco, if you want to take the stage.
Okay, thanks. Well,
yeah, you're very welcome.
Thank you very much. Well, for starters, I wanted to say hello to Nick. It's always a pleasure hearing from you, and also I wanted just to kind of provide my witness about how great was collaborating with that project about the many smiles project. It has been very hard, but I think that's also been very insightful in many ways. And one of the things that I would like to emphasize here, because it touches on the topics that we mostly cover. This is the Italian Reproducibility Network, and I think it's a really also a peculiar example about how replication sometimes can be something that is less straightforward than assumed, in the sense that, for instance, if you think about the lack of replication of the Strack et al., then maybe many people were tempted to throw the baby with the water and saying, okay, now it has disproved the whole facial feedback theory. But I think it was very impressive, the work that you have done before with the meta-analysis and afterwards by building this adversarial contribution that provided eventually a much more nuanced picture about the state of the art of the facial feedback theory. And I think it really provided a lot of food for thought about how we shouldn't hasten to throw away a whole theory just because we don't replicate one of the possible ways to operationalize that theory. And I think that also in this sense, this collaboration really provided an advancement of our knowledge, not only about the facial feedback theory, but about how psychological science works, I think, to some extent. And that's why also I was very glad to be involved in that. And thank you, Nick, for leading this effort.
Yeah, it was an absolute pleasure working with you. And for those who like to hear about the behind the scenes, Marco Tullio spent quite a bit of time running and rerunning power simulations as collaborators requested more complicated designs and more ambitious plans. And then we spent quite a bit of time trying to figure out some very tricky convergence issues with our very complex models, and then also trying to rework those and rework the Bayesian counterparts to those analyses so that we had a really truly comprehensive set of analyses. So without Marco Tullio, I don't think that that would have been possible. So yeah, really glad to have worked with you on that. And I agree. One of the things that I really liked about that project was sort of the epistemological implications of it. And the earlier drafts of the paper emphasized this more so than the final draft did, because reviewers end up pushing you in certain directions. But we really, in the original draft, focused a lot on what it is that we can and what it is that we often don't learn when we conduct a single direct replication. And we discussed what it is that we can learn and what it is that we often don't learn when we perform a meta-analysis. And we talked about the limitations of both of those pieces of evidence. A direct replication is usually a pretty narrow operationalization of a theory. Meta-analysis can be more broad, but can contain unidentified confounds, difficult to correct publication bias and selection bias. It can be impacted by low quality studies, etc. And so one of the ways that we describe this in the original paper is that if you could think of a wall, direct replication is like examining a single brick, and meta-analysis is like looking at the entire structure, but through a very, very blurry lens. And what the Many Smiles collaboration did that I thought was very unique is that by bringing together researchers and having them talk about the theory and collaborate on the design of a test, what we were trying to do and what I hope we accomplished is look at the foundation of that wall. Because if a large group of theory proponents say that these are the conditions that I think the theorized effect is most likely to emerge within, if you subsequently create those conditions and don't observe the effect, you have really demonstrated that their understanding of the phenomenon is not valid. If I say that this condition is most likely to confirm my theory, and then you don't observe it, I have at the very least provided a very strict test of your belief. And so one of the things that we talked about a lot in the early paper is that large-scale collaboration is also potentially a very effective way of testing researchers' beliefs about a phenomenon, and trying to design tests that will be maximally informative to the scientific community, as opposed to just testing my individual beliefs or tackling one person's criticism. So I'm glad that you brought that up, because it's something that I often don't get to talk about in the context of Many Smiles collaboration, particularly because the reviewers really pushed us to talk more about the theory as opposed to the meta-scientific advancement. But I'm really a fan of the collaborative model that we used. And it was a very challenging project to complete, because there were so many people with different views, but I think it was a really rewarding one to work on. So I'm hoping that people like Marco Tullio would consider joining another one of these projects in the future. A lot of work, but a lot of value.
Sure.
I do see, I'm going to read off the question from the chat that I can see. So it says, you can indicate that you want to ask a question by writing. Oh, sorry. Nope, that's not a comment. That is just instructions for how to actually ask a question. Okay.
Yes,
thank you.
No problem. But thanks for reading it aloud again, because if someone wants to ask question, that's the procedure. So I would go with a question. It's just it's more a curiosity. I was part of the variability in data analysis team neuroimaging study. I work as technician for, let's say, the flow of data of my research center. And what I found fascinating from that study is that I think in 5 years or less than 10 years in any case, I saw, let's say, a sort of paradigm shift in standardization of data formats and, let's say, I won't say softwares, but conceptualizing operations through software commands. And I was wondering whether this is part of your project as well. So technical aspects which triggers standardization of procedures and commands to scientists all over the world.
Yes, yes. I've been very impressed by what I've been seeing happening in that literature. Not only working on data harmonization, but standardizations of procedure and trying to calibrate even just different equipment setups so that they're more comparable. I've been watching that pretty closely and have been really inspired and impressed by it. Oftentimes in the Psychological Science Accelerator, we're not dealing with particularly difficult experimental setups. And so everything is very standardized in the sense that what we're typically doing is creating a centralized data collection link that is basically just loading up in different languages, but it is a single data collection program, which means it's also storing the data in a very centralized format, which some people might have had really awful experiences with large-scale collaborations where everyone goes and collects the data and it's in a totally different format and it's not at all comparable. I've seen that happen. It takes people years to harmonize the data sets. And then there's still a lot of uncertainty about procedural variability. So in the Psychological Science Accelerator, we tend to focus on extremely standardized paradigms that can be implemented through a single software that dynamically loads things in different languages and then stores the data in a standardized and centralized location. What I'll be working on over the next year, I actually just got noticed last night that I have some of the seed funds to start this, is expanding that into research on the psychophysiology of emotion, where we started by studying how facial expressions causally shape emotional experience, but the theories that we're working on are not just about the face, they're about the entire body. And so we want to start studying how the peripheral nervous system comes together to shape emotional experience and to build data sets that are not only useful for theory, but also useful for people who study emotion AI, who want to leverage really sophisticated neural network models, but can't do it if they only have a sample of 30 participants from a single study who are all run in a basement at Stanford. If you do that, you're going to end up using really weak methods because your neural nets won't perform very well, and you're probably going to create an extremely biased model that could be harmful if it's deployed in society. So that actually gets exactly to what is happening with the fMRI literature and bringing that to other areas. And essentially what we had to do is very early on, we are talking about data standardization and harmonization. And the solution that we've basically come up with so far is everyone has to use the same exact equipment, same exact computer, same exact sensors, same exact acquisition and amplifiers. And that's hard. That's really hard because not everyone's going to have that. So essentially what we're working on over the next year is building a psychophysiology data collection kit that we can just bring to people around the world and say, I know you have something else in your lab, but you need to use this set for this particular experiment. And that will really help us ensure that any variability that we're observing is not driven by something that we're relatively uninterested in, which is differences in equipment, but instead is driven by something more theoretically interesting, like variation in the stimuli that we're presenting to participants and variation in where those participants are located, et cetera. And I know Marco Tullio and I have discussed this a little bit as well, because when we do observe the variability, then you start having questions about where is that variability coming from? And if your procedures aren't standardized, you're not going to learn much, because it might be that you're seeing variability because of differences in cultural backgrounds and learning, or maybe it's just that they use different procedures or sampled a totally different subset of the population. So standardization and protocol is a major step forward, I think. And we've done it with the simpler studies in the Psychological Science Accelerator, which are relatively easy to standardize, but now I'm trying to push it into other domains, drawing inspiration from the fMRI literature. So that'll also be a really challenging and slow moving project. I'll warn everyone about that ahead of time if they're considering collaborating with me on that one. It will be harder than the Many Smiles collaboration was, I think, but I think it'll also be one of those projects that will be very difficult, but extremely informative and extremely high impact. So I think it's worth the investment.
Thanks.
Thank you. If there are not any other question, I think, well, it's probably also time to wrap it up because it's already after 6. So thank you again a lot. I think, well, I really enjoyed your presentation, and I'm pretty sure that also all the other people did enjoy it. And also the data that you presented were really impressive about the importance of this kind of research. And so thank you again. Now, finally, a few general information for our audience. For those who asked it, who requested in the subscription, the certificate of attendance, you will receive it. You will receive an email certifying your attendance to the seminar within the next 7 days. As I mentioned also last time, the email is the only certificate of attendance that we can send you. So please do not ask us for other kinds because we cannot send it. We cannot send them. Also, another interesting information for our PhD students is that next month's speaker is Rima Maria Rahal. She will be talking about replication studies, so she will be going into detail exactly about this aspect. It is also, I think, very useful. It will be also very useful talk for, especially for, but not only for PhD students. And finally, we will inform you, we will inform the members of ITRN via email when we upload the video of this presentation on YouTube. And I think that's it for today. So thank you to everybody for being here, and goodbye.